The document arrived on a Tuesday. Not by post. By email, forwarded from Marcus's personal account to mine with a subject line that said, "Mum sent this. Can you look at it tonight?" I opened it after dinner. The document was titled, Family Loan Schedule, Outstanding Balances. It was 3 pages long. It listed 23 transactions, each with a date, an amount, and a description. The transactions ran from 2018 to 2024. The total at the bottom was €47,200. The final line of the document said, "Given the changed circumstances of the family, these outstanding balances are now requested to be settled in full within 60 days of receipt of this communication." I read it twice. I put the laptop down. I went to find Marcus. He was in the kitchen washing up. I said, "I have read the document." He said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I need to understand what it is." He said, "So do I." I said, "This is money your mother gave us." He said, "Yes." I said, "Over 6 years." He said, "Yes." I said, "For Christmas, for our wedding, for your 40th birthday." He said, "Yes." I said, "She is calling it a loan schedule." He said, "Yes." I said, "Is there a signed agreement anywhere?" He said, "No." I said, "Has the word loan ever been used?" He said, "Not that I can find." I said, "Marcus." He said, "I know." I said, "My investment round closes in 6 weeks." He was quiet. He said, "I know." I said, "The due diligence is clean." He said, "I know." I said, "If the VC firm gets any indication of a debt dispute involving the founders." He said, "I know." He said, "Kate," he said, "I am going to deal with this." I said, "I need you to deal with it before it reaches them." He said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to deal with it tomorrow." He said, "I am going to go through every transaction on that list." He said, "I am going to find every communication around every transaction." He said, "And I'm going to send it all to my mother." I said, "And then?" He said, "And then I am going to ask her one question." I said, "What question?" He said, "What was this document intended to do?" I said, "What do you think the answer is?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think she found out about the round from my sister." I said, "Yes." He said, "I think she did not know about the round until my sister told her." I said, "Yes." He said, "I think she felt left out." I said, "Of my business?" He said, "Of the story." I said, "Of which story?" He said, "The one about what we built." He said, "I think she thought the money made her part of it." I said, "It was a birthday card, Marcus." I said, "It said love and love and love." He said, "I know." He said, "I know what it was." He said, "She may not have known what it was in the same way." I sat with that. I said, "That is a very charitable reading." He said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to hold the charitable reading while I build the case." He said, "The charitable reading does not change the case." I said, "No." He said, "It might change what I say after the case." I said, "Okay." He said, "Let me work tonight." I said, "Yes. I want to tell you who I am before I tell you what Marcus found. Because the round and the investment and the business are the context for the document, but they are not the whole of who I am or what I had built, and I want you to have both things before we get to the evidence. My name is Anna. I am 38 years old. I have been building a technology consultancy for 3 years. I started it because I have been working in digital transformation for 12 years and I had understood the specific thing I was good at. and I had understood that I could do it better independently than I was doing it inside a large company. I had left the large company in September 2022. I had taken nothing with me, except the knowledge and the clients who chose to follow, and the specific understanding of the problem I was solving. I had worked from the kitchen table for 14 months before the first hire. The first hire was a woman named Priya, who had been one of my colleagues, and who had believed in the business before I had fully believed in it myself. The second hire was a man named David, who had found us through a referral. The third hire was Marcus's cousin's friend's recommendation, which is how many of the good hires happen. 4 people and a kitchen table and 3 years of building. By November 2025, I had 12 clients, 4 employees, a strong track record of delivered projects, and a venture capital firm interested in leading a €2 million investment round to allow us to scale. The VC firm had completed 6 weeks of due diligence. The due diligence was clean. The business was clean. Everything was in order. I had spent 3 years making sure everything was in order, and the evidence of those 3 years was a clean due diligence in November 2025. Document arrived on a Tuesday in the week before the anticipated close of the round. 23 transactions. €47,200. 60 days to settle. I want to tell you something about the timing. The timing was precise. Not coincidentally precise. Precisely precise. Sylvia had learned about the investment round from Marcus's sister at a family lunch 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had mentioned the round at the lunch. His sister had been excited and had shared it with Sylvia the following day. Sylvia had not been told directly. She had not been at the lunch. She had heard it secondhand from her daughter, who had shared it as good news, as family news, in the specific way that good news circulates in families. And 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, the loan schedule arrived. The timing tells you the purpose. I had learned, over 3 years of building a business, that the most reliable indicator of a document's purpose is its timing. A document sent the week before a round closes, after decades of documented gifts, is not a document about money. It is a document about something else. I needed to know what the something else was before I could address it. Marcus found it. Marcus worked until 2 in the morning. I knew this because I was awake until 2 in the morning, on the other side of the house, doing the work I had to do for the VC follow-up, questions that had arrived that afternoon, and I could see the light under the office door. At 2:15 the light went out. He came to bed. He said, "I have all 23. I said, "All of them." He said, "Every transaction." He said, "I have the bank confirmation, the contemporaneous communication, and the highlighted language for each one." He said, "There is not a single word of loan in any of them." I said, "Tell me the biggest ones." He said, "The 15,000 in 2019 was accompanied by an email that said, 'I want to help you get started. Dad and I are so proud of you. Please use this to build something good.'" He said, "The 8,000 for the wedding was a card that said, 'For your special day, from both of us. All our love.'" He said, "The 7,500 for the house deposit was a WhatsApp message." He showed me his phone. The message said, "Here is our contribution to your first home together. Consider it a gift from us to you both." He said, "She used the word gift. She wrote the word." I said, "Yes." He said, "The 3,000 for my 40th birthday." He showed me the card he had kept. He keeps birthday cards. I had not known this about him until that night at 2 in the morning. He keeps them in a box in the bottom of the wardrobe. He had gone to the box and found the card. The card said, "Happy 40th birthday, my darling. To many more years of love and life. All my love always, Mum." He said, "I have 23 of these." He said, 23 occasions on which she gave us money with love and the communication. He said, 23 records in which the money was given and received as a gift. I said, the word loan does not appear. He said, not once. He said, not in an email, not in a card, not in a text, not in any document I can find over 6 years. He said, I have built a spreadsheet. He said, column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, occasion. Column D, communication. Column E, relevant language. He said, column E is full of love. I said, she wrote love and love on the 40th birthday card. He said, yes. He said, that is column E for transaction 16. He said, love and love and love. He said, is not alone. No. He said, I am going to send this to her tomorrow. I said, before the lawyer. He said, before the lawyer. I said, why? He said, because I want her to know that I did this. Not the lawyer. Me. He said, I want her to know that I went through 23 transactions and found 23 records. And I built the spreadsheet, and I'm sending it with one question. I said, the one question. He said, what was this document intended to do? I said, and when you have the answer, he said, then we will know what we are dealing with. He said, and then I will know what to say. I said, Marcus. He said, yes. I said, thank you. He said, this is my family too. He said, she is my mother. He said, and what she has produced this week is not okay. He said, I need you to know, I see that clearly. I said, I do know that. He said, good. He said, sleep now. I said, yes. I turned off the light on my side. The spreadsheet existed. 23 rows. Column E full of love. That is also what the document was. The email went to Sylvia at 9:15 on Wednesday morning. Marcus had written it the night before and held it overnight to read it fresh in the morning. He read it again at 9 and sent it. I want to give it to you as he gave it to me, which is the full text. He said, Mum. He said, I have received the document you sent titled Family Loan Schedule, Outstanding Balances. He said, I have spent the past day going through the 23 transactions you have listed. He said, I am attaching to this email the contemporaneous communications I have found for each transaction. He said, each attachment is labeled with the transaction number from your schedule. He said, I have highlighted the relevant language in each document. He said, the relevant language is the language that describes the nature of the money at the time it was given. He said, I want to be specific about what I found. He said, Transaction 1, 2018, €2,000 Christmas. Attachment. WhatsApp message, December 2018. Highlighted. Just a little something for you both, with all our love. He said, Transaction 7, 2019, €15,000. Attachment. Email, March 2019. Highlighted. I want to help you get started. Please use this to build something good. He said, Transaction 12, 2021, €8,000 our wedding. Attachment. Card. Highlighted. For your special day. From both of us. All our love. He said, Transaction 16, 2022, €3,000, my 40th birthday. Attachment. Card. Highlighted. Love and love and love. He said, I have attached all 23. He said, the word loan does not appear in any of them. He said, not in a single communication. He said, not once over 6 years. He said, I want to ask you one question and I am asking it here, in writing, because I want both of us to have the record of the question and the answer. He said, what was the document you sent on Tuesday intended to do? He said, I am not asking what it could do legally, because there is no signed loan agreement. There is no contemporaneous evidence of a loan relationship, and the available documentation establishes clearly that the money was given and received as gifts. He said, I am asking what you intended. He said, I am asking because I would like to understand before I respond further. He said, I will wait for your answer. He sent the email. He closed the laptop. He went to make coffee. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop. I said, You sent it? He said, Yes. He said, 24 attachments. He said, 23 transactions and the covering email. I said, She will have it now. He said, Yes. He said, I want her to read it before she calls. He said, I asked in writing. I want the answer in writing. I said, She may not answer in writing. He said, No. He said, But the question is in writing. He said, The question exists. I said, Yes. He sat down with his coffee. He said, Anna, he said, I want to tell you something. I said, Yes. He said, I have never been prouder of what you have built. He said, I want you to know that I have always been proud of it. He said, The business is yours. He said, It has always been yours. He said, My mother's document does not change that. I said, I know. He said, I need you to hear it from me directly. He said, The business is yours. The kitchen table is yours. The 3 years are yours. He said, No document changes the ownership of something you built. I said, I know. I said, I have known that since the first morning at the kitchen table. He said, Yes. He said, I just needed you to hear me say it today. I said, I heard you. He said, Good. He poured me a coffee. I went back to the laptop. The VC follow-up questions were waiting. I answered them. Sylvia called Marcus on Thursday, not an email. A call. He had asked for writing and she had called. He took the call in the office. I heard his side of it through the door, not entirely but in fragments, and he filled in her side afterward. She had said, I received your email. He had said, Yes. She had said, All of the attachments. He had said, Yes. She had said, I want to explain. He had said, I am listening. She had said, When your father was alive. She said, When your father and I were giving you money. I thought of it as. She had paused. I thought of it as investing in you. As being part of what you were building. As being part of the family enterprise. He had said, The family enterprise. She had said, Your father helped his father with the farm. The money went back and forth in a family. Nobody kept accounts because nobody needed to, because everyone was part of the same thing. He had said, I understand. She had said, And when I gave you the money for your business, I thought I was doing what his father did. I thought the money made me a part of it. He had said, His father and his father's father worked on the farm together. She had said, Yes. He had said, You gave me a gift when I started my business. She had said, I know that now. He had said, There is a difference between a family that works a farm together and a family where the mother gives her son a gift to start his own independent business. She had said, I see that. He had said, And even if there were not a difference, it is not my business. He had said, The business you are asking to be part of is Anna's. She had said, I know. He had said, I am proud of Anna's business. He had said, I am not a founder. He had said, I am the person who makes the coffee and asks the good questions and has been watching 3 years of work become something real. He had said, That is what I am. He had said, You are the mother who gave us gifts. He had said, The gifts were generous and they were real. He had said, they were given with love. He had said, I have the evidence of the love. He had said, the love does not entitle anyone to a stake. She had been quiet. He had said, Mum. He had said, I need to ask you to withdraw the document. She had said, I have already destroyed it. He had said, when? She had said, Wednesday night. She had said, after I read your email. She had said, I read every attachment. She had said, the card with the love and love and love. She had said, I sat with that. He had said, I kept the card. She had been quiet again. Then she had said, I wanted to be part of something. She had said, since your father died, I have not been part of something. She had said, I thought the money made me part of your story. He had said, Mum. He had said, the money is not the story. He had said, the story is this. You and Dad gave us things over 23 occasions because you loved us. He had said, that is the story. He had said, it is a good story. He had said, I would like you to hold that story. He had said, and I would like you to understand that Anna's business has a different story, which starts in September 2022 at the kitchen table with one person, and no money and an idea. He had said, that is Amy's story. He had said, it is a remarkable story. He had said, I would like you to be proud of it. She had said, I am. She had said, I know I have not shown it. He had said, no. He had said, you have shown something else instead. She had said, yes. He had said, the document is gone. She had said, yes. He had said, I will tell Anna. She had said, tell her I am sorry. He had said, yes. He had said, and Mum. He had said, when the round closes, I would like you to come for dinner. She had said, yes. She had said, I would like that. He had hung up. He had come into the kitchen. He had said, she destroyed the document Wednesday night. I had said, after reading the email. He had said, after reading the love and love and love. I had said, yes. He had said, she wants to come for dinner when the round closes. I had said, yes. He had said, I said yes. I had looked at him. I had said, you said yes already. He had said, she has been part of 23 occasions over 6 years. He had said, the occasions were real. He had said, she made bad use of the record of them. He had said, the record is still there. He had said, the occasions still happened. He had said, I would like her to be part of the closing dinner, because the 23 occasions are in the hood background of the 3 years, even if they are not the story of the 3 years. I had sat with that. I had said, Marcus. He had said, yes. I had said, that is a very precise and correct thing to say. He had said, I know. He had said, I thought about it while I was making the spreadsheet. The VC situation. I need to tell you what happened with the investment round, because it is part of the account. Our lawyer had been copied on the loan schedule document when Sylvia sent it, because all correspondence related to the business goes to our lawyer as a matter of practice. The lawyer had flagged it immediately. She had called me on Wednesday morning while Marcus was building the spreadsheet, and she had said, I have received a copy of a document from a Sylvia Reeves claiming outstanding loans of €47,200. She had said, I need to ask you whether this has any basis in fact. I had said, Marcus is building the response. She had said, how long? I had said, this afternoon. She had said, the VC has a standing instruction to notify them of any new financial claims or disputes involving the founders. She had said, I am going to have to notify them. I had said, I understand. She had said, I will tell them the matter is being addressed and that we expect documentation within 24 hours. I had said, yes. She had said, Anna, She had said, "Is this what it looks like?" I had said, "It looks like a mother who felt left out of her son's wife's success and produced a document designed to create a problem at a sensitive time." She had said, "That is also what it looks like from here." She had said, "I will manage the VC." She had. The VC had received a notification Wednesday morning and a follow-up package Thursday afternoon. Marcus's email, the 23 attachments, the contemporaneous documentation confirming gift status, and Sylvia's confirmation that the document had been destroyed. The lawyer's covering note said, "The matter has been resolved." The transactions in question were documented gifts over a 6-year period, and no loan relationship existed between the parties. The VC resumed the due diligence process on Friday. The round closed the following Thursday. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the lawyer called to confirm. She said, "It has closed." She said, "Congratulations, Anna." She said, 3 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "The kitchen table." I said, "Yes." I said, "I know." She said, "Well done." She hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. Marcus was at the counter. He was making the coffee that takes 12 minutes. Not the fast kind. The slow kind he makes when there is a reason to make it slow. He said, "It closed." I said, "Yes." He said, "Say it again." I said, "It closed." He made the coffee. It took 12 minutes. We sat at the kitchen table and drank it. The kitchen smelled like coffee and 3 years of morning starts, and the specific warmth of a thing that has been worked for. And that is now real. I said, "Your mother is coming for dinner." He said, "Saturday." I said, "Yes." I said, "I'm going to make pasta." He said, "The garlic and olive oil kind." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He said, "She will be early." I said, "Yes." He said, "She is always early." I said, "I know." He said, "It is one of her things." I said, "I know." He said, "I want you to know something." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to be in that kitchen on Saturday, and I am going to watch my mother sit at the table where you built this business. And I am going to feel 2 things at the same time." He said, "I am going to feel proud of you." He said, "And I am going to feel the 23 occasions in the background of the room." He said, "And I am going to hold both." I said, "Yes." He said, "I think that is the correct thing." I said, "I think so too." The Saturday dinner. Sylvia was early. She arrived 18 minutes before we had said, and she stood at the door with a bottle of wine and a specific expression that I had not seen on her face before. Not the warm, managed expression of her usual arrivals, not the performance of enthusiasm, but something that was quieter and more real, the expression of someone who is arriving somewhere uncertain, and who is doing it anyway. I opened the door. She said, "I am early." I said, "I know." I said, "Come in." She came in. She gave me the wine. She said, "Anna." I said, "Sylvia." She said, "I am sorry." She said it simply. Not elaborately. Not with a speech. Just, "I am sorry." I said, "I know." I said, "Marcus told me." She said, "I need to say it to you directly." She said, "The document was wrong." She said, "The business is yours." She said, "It has always been yours." She said, She paused. "I was trying to be part of something." She said, "I did it in a way that was wrong." I said, "Yes." I said, "You did." I said, "Come in and sit down." She came in. She sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen table where I had been working for 3 years. She sat at it and she looked at it, and I watched her look at it. the specific surface of a table that is also a 3-year record. And I thought about what Marcus had said. I am going to watch my mother sit at the table where you built this business. She was sitting at it. I was watching. He came in from the back. He said, "You are early." She said, "I know." He said, "I expected you to be early." He kissed her. He poured the wine. He said, "Anna is making pasta." She said, "The garlic kind." He said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said it in the specific warm tone she uses when she is genuinely pleased rather than performing pleasure. She said, "I like the garlic kind." He said, "I know." I started making the pasta. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and olive oil. Sylvia sat at the table and watched me cook. She said, after a while, "How did you know what you were good at?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, 3 years ago, when you decided to start. How did you know? I said, I had been doing it for 12 years inside a large company. I said, I knew what I understood about the problem, and I knew that I understood it better than most people I had worked with. She said, and that was enough. I said, no. I said, that was the starting position. She said, what else? I said, the kitchen table. I said, the first 14 months alone. I said, the first hire, Priya, who believed in it before I fully did. She said, the belief of someone who knows you. I said, yes. She said, that matters. I said, more than anything else. She said, yes. She said, I think I understand that. She said, I thought the money was the believing. I said, the money was separate. I said, the believing is its own thing. She said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, your father would have been proud. She was talking to Marcus. He said, I know. He said, I am. She said, I know you are. She said it in the tone of a mother who is watching her son be proud of his wife, and who is, for perhaps the first time, fully receiving what that means, rather than placing herself in the frame of it. I noted it. I kept cooking. The garlic was perfect. The pasta was perfect. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table and ate it. The table that was 3 years of work. The table that was also a Saturday evening in December with the wine, and the early arrival and the direct apology and the question about what I had known at the beginning. All of it at the table. All of it mine. I want to tell you the last thing Marcus said that evening. After Sylvia had gone, he stood at the sink washing up. He said, Anna. I said, yes. He said, there is no invoice for love. I said, what? He said, that is what I am going to remember from this week. He said, she gave us 23 gifts over 6 years. He said, each one was love in a useful form. He said, there is no invoice for love. He said, the love was the gift. He said, the gift was given. He said, the record is complete. He said, anything on top of that is the wrong reading of the record. I said, yes. He said, that is the whole thing. I said, yes. He said, write that down. I said, I will. Here is my question for you. If your Mel produced a fake loan schedule at the most critical moment of your business career, and your husband built the evidence case against it himself, without a lawyer, overnight, what would you have said to your Mel at the dinner table when the round closed? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. One more thing I want to tell you. About the word gift. I have been thinking about it since the Tuesday the document arrived, and I want to give you what I have been thinking. A gift is a thing given without condition. That is the definition of the word. Not a thing given with the expectation of a return. Not a thing given as a stake in a future. A thing given without condition. Complete in the giving. The 23 occasions were gifts. The cards and the emails and the WhatsApp messages say so. The column E in Marcus's spreadsheet says so. The language of the love says so. What Sylvia had been trying to retrofit onto the gifts was a condition. The condition of belonging to the story. The condition of being a part of the enterprise. The condition of being necessary and included and acknowledged. The gifts did not carry that condition when they were given. The condition was applied later, from a position of feeling left out of something that had not required her. I understand the impulse. I hold it with more complexity than I would have held it on Tuesday, before reading the cards. The love and love and love is real. It is in column E. The love is the record. The love is what was given. The business is what was built. The two things have the same address, but they are not the same thing, and they do not share the same equity. A gift is complete in the giving. The record is complete. The business is mine. The love in column E is hers. Both things are true. Both things are in the account. That is the whole of it.